Star Wars night.
Yep, tonight's the Star Wars night.
Tonight's the Star Wars night. Yeah, go for it.
It's not an inaccurate description, but tonight we have this is a very special night, as many of us have stated, I think a couple times during this night, where we have our guest speaker, Dr. John C. Lyden. John is a Star Wars fan in his own right. When he graduated in school in 1977, he saw the first Star Wars film, Episode 4, A New Hope, in theaters. He related most to Luke Skywalker because of how both of them left familiar grounds and went into adulthood. Luke Skywalker remains the character he relates to the most these days because both of them are grumpy old men who are tired of politics. John earned his bachelor's at the Wesleyan University of Nebraska in philosophy, and then he continued his with his master's from Yale University for theology, and then getting his PhD in theology at the University of Chicago. But his studies have taken him in quite a different direction, where he now focuses on religion and film, and more specifically, religion and Star Wars. John has published numerous articles on how Star Wars relates to how Star Wars relates to religion. More specifically, he takes the stance that the Star Wars fan base is a religion because of its sense of communal identity. He has published articles on it and even helped co-edit the first religious studies book on Star Wars called The Myth Awakens, Canon Conservatism and Fan Reception of Star Wars, where we discussed the franchise in relation not only to religion, but also other topics like politics, race, and gender. He has can apparently do a very spot-on impression of the characters from the original trilogy, but he only does it on special occasions. So nobody asked him to do it. He's not even going to do it. So everyone, without further ado, let us welcome our guest, John C. Lyden.
Yeah, I probably will sit. It's a very comfortable chair, so thank you for that. I won't go to sleep though. But yeah, Micah also neglected to mention he was in my Star Wars and Religion class, which was a special topics and religion class this last spring. And that's where we used that book and read all the other stuff. And of course, had a whole semester on this, and it was very well received, and the class really enjoyed it. There's a lot of Star Wars fans coming from different majors, but they all totally got on board with the different ways we could look at this. And I think, sometimes people are surprised you could do that much with Star Wars and religion, but you definitely can. Yeah, so that was definitely a thing. Yeah, also my background, as you said, I started in philosophy and then went on to theology from there. And I appreciate that there's this diversity of religious viewpoints here as well, which is really cool. And I will give a shout out to the religious studies program here, because if you are interested in a minor or a major, be happy to talk to you about that, or other people in the department. And it is a diverse department in terms of the religious perspectives and viewpoints of the people, their academic background, their religious background. We have it all. So there's no assumption that one is religious when one studies religion. It just means you're interested in religion. People come from a variety of perspectives, and it seems like you all represent that as well, being interested in the topic. As far as
forgot to mention too that you'll be offering a class in the spring semester called On Religion, Film, and Violence. So my apologies for forgetting to bring that up.
Yeah, and that's going to be my next special topics course in the spring, because I'm working on a book on that, and that's something I have written somewhat about in my book Film as Religion, which I'm using. I always use my books and courses, but which I'm using this semester. Every fall I teach the generic religion and film course, and then I've been doing some of these special topics as kind of one-offs on different things. But yeah, I've been studying this for a long time. I've been a Star Wars fan for a long time, obviously. Yeah, you outed my age, so I'm really old, obviously.
I never said how old you were.
Yeah, well, I was a child prodigy, but yeah, that was graduating high school in '77. Yes, so that makes me a little bit younger than if it was college. But I think that.
Did I say college? I meant high school.
No, you didn't. But I just wanted to clarify that they're not quite as old as people might think.
Okay.
But yeah, no question.
Was the ObiWans lightsaber color cooler back in the 1970s than it is now?
Oh, wow, that's, oh, you mean like, has it changed with all
But,
these?
I mean, like, was it cooler watching it back then, like that old blue color? Wasn't it cooler back then?
Yeah, and also Alec Guinness's moves were pretty slow, by regular standards. So, yeah, it was definitely different seeing the episode then. It was, you really can't appreciate how amazing it was at that time because there was nothing like it beforehand. And obviously it's come a long way since then. But yeah, in addition to having been a Star Wars fan all these years, I did go on and teach at a variety of places, teaching theology and religion. But here, having come here last year, in the middle of the pandemic, of course, my focus has been chiefly on religion and film, and the department added my position basically with that focus in mind. So I've written about that for years, and it's great to be able to offer so many different courses. So again, I encourage you to look some of those up, or anything in religious studies that interests you, obviously. In terms of stuff to talk about, Micah shared with me some questions that came from you all. So I was going to kind of structure my remarks around that, and again, kind of informally respond to some of that and give you maybe a little background on how I approach some of these topics. And again, hearing about your own interests and background, I could imagine some ways the conversation could go, and some interesting questions about in what ways is following Star Wars like a religion, which is usually the big question people have, and people are very suspicious about that. How could that possibly be the case? But there is some evidence in favor of that thesis. I would say that to start with the more basic stuff, just looking at the texts of Star Wars, and that includes the 9 basic movies, I'm assuming you're all pretty familiar with, as well as everything else considered canon by Disney now, which includes some of the animated series, but then there's a lot of stuff not in the canon. That's also part of the experience of fans. There's fan created products. It's a somewhat gigantic industry, both homemade as well as industry supported. So again, there's a lot to study, and maybe you are very familiar with all of this. But all of this, in some ways, does resemble religion, but also incorporates a lot of different religious influences. To go back to George Lucas, obviously, and what he created from the origin, he structured the original movie, as you may know, along the lines of Joseph Campbell's understanding of the hero's journey. And that is one mythic structure of the hero who sets out from home and undergoes certain ordeals and matures and has to confront his father. And it's sort of right to type. The first movie very much conforms to this, or the first trilogy in a lot of ways that came out. That is one way to understand it. I have said a number of times in print, that's not the only way to understand it. And when we talk about mythology, I think that was another one of the questions. In what ways are mythology and religion similar or different? Religious studies scholars talk about myth all the time, of course. And basically what they mean by that is sacred stories that structure a certain understanding of the world. So all religions, so-called, have something like that. Sometimes people mean something narrower by mythology, and they may mean something different than Western religion. And I think that's partly because people who practice Western religions are reluctant to use the term myth in terms of their own stories, but there's no reason that you couldn't use that word. It doesn't imply true or false. It may or may not have a basis in historical fact in a given case, but also there's stories that people find meaningful. And that may be the most important thing about myths and sacred stories also. So in that way, you can say, how important is it that a story really happened? I think that's another one of the questions one can ask about fans of Star Wars or any kind of fictional series, fans of Lord of the Rings, fans of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, etc. They didn't really happen, right? And yet people can be really into them and structure their values around it and care about the characters and be really upset when the story goes a certain way they didn't want it to go. And how dare you change that footage about, Han shooting first at Greedo? That's not what happened, right? George Lucas famously argues, no, they actually did shoot at the same time. Like, we are talking about a movie, right? It's like that people talk about as if it really happened. So the stories can become more real than history in some ways if they are meaningful to people. I'd also make the point that actual religions, things we normally call religions like Christianity, say, for example, which does obviously claim a lot of history to its stories, or Judaism or Islam, Western religions in particular. Again, there are people who follow those religions who don't take everything literally about those stories, and may take almost nothing literally about those stories, and still can find great meaning in them and significance in them. So there's a range of views on that. Usually people from Western backgrounds are more hung up on historicity, and that's something about Western civilization, I think, and scientism, and the fact that we want things to be verifiable. But many religions don't seem to really worry about that at all. And so the stories can be meaningful in a deeper way. So I think that opens up the possibility of fictional universes being just as powerful, or being a basis for a religious vision of the world, as it were. So with, again, a bunch of the questions that were submitted to me ahead of time, I would deconstruct a lot of those categories as a religious scholar. So to say myth and religion, not so different. Myths, always true, always false, not necessarily. What do we mean about truth? How do we define that? Are we talking about historical truth? Are we talking about some other level of truth? So the categories are things that we can question and interrogate as we go along. Yeah, go ahead, Will.
Yeah, I just kind of, you're touching on some of the questions I was asking. And so to kind of like push on you a little bit more, like if I'm looking at like Christianity or Islam or Judaism, they might, I can see your point in that there's a lot of like myth in those religions, and a lot of it might not be taken literally by the proponents of said religion. But I feel like pretty much everybody in those religions would agree that like God is real, or like if you're a Buddhist, karma is real. But if you're a fan of Star Wars, like I would think most people wouldn't say like the Force is real.
Well, sure they would, because they could equate it to other concepts of that, or equivalent concepts to it, like God, the Tao, Brahman, etc.
Would that be your?
Yeah, they could believe in it in some real sense. And anytime you're talking about something like God or the Tao or Dharma or something like that, how you talk about the reality of that is already different. It's not an empirical reality. It's not a verifiable reality. It's not even something that is spatial or temporal. And so to say God is real or God exists, theologians have spent a lot of time thinking about that question. What does that even mean? Does that mean there's a basis of existence? Does the term God apply to all of existence in its ground? There's a lot of ways you can talk about that. And it's not necessarily as a distinct or separate being. Paul Tillich, one of the most famous Christian theologians of the 20th century, famously said, God is not a being, God is being itself. And you can't really deny the existence of being, and everybody worships something. It just depends what they call that or how they describe that thing. So everyone has a God in some sense, and reality has a basis to it. So how we conceptualize that may vary, but everybody has some understanding of that. Now that's debatable. That's his view, obviously, but I think that shows that how we talk about reality claims, especially about transcendent realities, is again very, very negotiable. And I would say, a Star Wars fan, somebody who follows Star Wars as a way of life, wouldn't even necessarily have to believe in the Force as some kind of transcendent, separate reality, but maybe view it as the heart of the principles that they follow, especially if there's a moral code that follows from that, like decreasing anger and aggression and fear, the Jedi way of life. That's a thing. You can actually do that, and that's one of the things that, again, Star Wars has taken from elsewhere, has borrowed, because you have those ideas in Hinduism, you have them in Buddhism. That's very much an idea from Eastern religions about detaching from those negative emotions. So if one finds that in Star Wars, if one makes that part of one's central principles you live by, those ideas have a religious pedigree to them, but one may be naming it in a Star Wars form and following it in that way, having found it through those fictional stories. It's just as real to that person, or just as true to them as someone who hears the stories of the Buddha, and it inspires them to it, or the stories from the Bhagavad Gita. Did the Bhagavad Gita really happen? Who knows? There was probably some kind of a battle Were Krishna and Arjuna really saying all that stuff on the battlefield for those 72 chapters or whatever? Maybe not, but there's a lot of truth in there that comes out of those stories that people base their lives on. So that can be the case with Star Wars as well, I would argue, and is the case for some people.
So would it be kind of fair to say that what you're saying is there is not really any way to distinguish between like a religion and a following of any work of fiction, if as long as people like take some sort of message or, I don't know, life advice from it?
Well, I think one of the things, if you don't mind me
Yeah, go
saying,
ahead.
because you even talked about this in one of your papers on whose Star Wars is it anyway, where the thing that attracts people to Star Wars is they just have to believe it. They don't have to believe in it. Like a kind of moral code, for example, that Star Wars proposes, the Jedi code.
Yeah, and there's going to be different ways that they approach that. I guess part of my argument here, and again, there's people who, as religious studies scholars, who do push back a lot on me when I talk about film as a religion or operating as a religion in these ways. They say, how there's some important distinctions. My point, though, is that the lines are increasingly blurry. And the more you look at religions and you see how blurry the definitions there even are, and there's a long history of debate about what really is a religion. There are some religious studies scholars who don't even want to use the word religion anymore because it's so contested. So, for example, Christopher Columbus comes to the Americas and sees these natives here who are worshiping gods, talking about an afterlife, doing rituals, doing sacrifices. And he says, oh, they don't have religion. No, it's definitely not religion. And then he enslaves them and murders them and does all kinds of horrible things to them and dehumanizes them, partly because he was able to distance himself from them and say, oh, they don't have religion, they're savages. So sometimes there's a historical way in which people are marginalized by saying, you don't have a real religion. Or when missionaries came to China and found Confucians, and they said, well, this doesn't look like a religion. We're not really talking about God. They talk about the ancestors a lot, but it's kind of a moral code. Yeah, it's not really religion. It wasn't their religion. It didn't have the trappings of Christianity, but Confucianism functions exactly like a religion in Chinese history. It's got all the dimensions of that structuring community life for thousands of years, and does have transcendent ideals associated with it as well, even if they don't look like what Westerners might think religion is. So the category keeps enlarging, and kind of my insight when I started a lot of these studies was looking at popular culture. I realized there were people finding meaning through those structures, and was it really that different? And you might say, well, is that really make it a religion? Well, it is religion-like, at least, and it becomes hard to define things. One of the questions too was about, can you get tax-exempt status as a follower of Star Wars? Yeah, you actually can, because the Temple of the Jedi Order has tax-exempt status as a religion in the United States, not in the UK. So the British are a little bit tougher, but the criteria that the IRS uses, there are groups of Star Wars followers who qualify because they do rituals, they have a community, they have moral beliefs. And if you convince the IRS, that's a pretty tough argument there. That must mean something. So, yeah.
What marks do the Jedi Church not hit in the UK that like Scientology does? Because Scientology is recognized as a religion, but it is similar in fashion to the Jedi Church.
Yeah, maybe it's the fact that they think maybe the fictional point is key for them. I'm not sure how the British government has made these determinations, honestly. So I looked up the criteria for the United States and what they do. I did notice in an article I found that the British do not accept them, but I don't know exactly what their argument is, but it could be something like that. They just don't regard it as being quite as serious. Whereas, Scientologists do literally believe in a bunch of stuff about UFOs and all kinds of stuff. So probably most followers of Star Wars don't have those literal beliefs that there really were Jedi long, long ago, et cetera, et cetera. But I think also religion and how it's perceived in England are different in some ways, because famously a few years ago, and this is where some of the data comes from about Star Wars as religion, they asked people's religion on the census in a lot of English-speaking countries. I think it also included like New Zealand and Australia. And a lot of people were very angry to be asked that question. They thought it was a private question. And so they put down all kinds of silly things. But a lot of people put down Jedi. And so then the question became, was this a joke? Was this a protest? Or did they really mean this? And it seems like some of them actually meant it. But it was also probably a pushback against institutional definitions of religion and how dare they try to control me. But I think the government is somewhat controlling because they have a state church after all. And that state church gets special perks that other religions don't get in the United Kingdom. And that's true in a lot of European countries. One thing the US has going for it is we don't have a state church. We don't have the establishment of religion. So it's supposed to be a more or less equal playing field for anything that can qualify as a religion. Again, it's still debatable. It isn't really an equal playing field, and some religions are discriminated against. But at least the IRS has been convinced in this particular case to do it this way. Yeah, no, you have a question.
There was a question that Dustin was asking. He said he's interested in what your operating definition of religion is.
And I remember we discussed this where you were in a, and you can feel free to vary your definition from this, but you were in agreement of Clifford Geertz's definition of how a set of symbols that people believe in supposed to be real.
Yeah, it's Clifford Geertz, the American anthropologist, has an article, goes back to the 1960s, actually, been very influential. And again, some people don't like Geertz, but I still have stuck with his definition for years because it's a functionalist definition that I think is broad enough to basically cover all the things we normally think of as religions. And yeah, it's a symbol system which functions to give people meaning and includes the three elements of myths, morals, and rituals. It depicts a vision of how the world is believed to be, as well as how is believed it should be, like the vision of morality, and has rituals that connect the two, that try to realize the ideal within the real. And so when I wrote Film as Religion, I was going to examine this thesis basically, see if I could convince myself that films really were like religions. Is this true? You know, to what extent is that true? I first of all thought that was the broadest definition of religion, just in general, and then sort of applied that to popular culture to see if it fit. And as far as I could tell, it did in many, many ways, because again, you have myths, you have rituals, you have a set of morals, and it functions in all the ways in which Geertz talks about. Geertz didn't expand his definition to popular culture, and I think it was partly because he didn't see a participatory dimension of popular culture. And in fact, in his essay, written in the 1960s, he compares going to a Balinese ritual where people are involved, they're dancing, and they're all coming out, to a bunch of people watching a play. And so if you're watching a play, you're sitting in the audience like this and no one's doing anything, maybe they clap once in a while, that doesn't seem very participatory. But I don't think Clifford Geertz ever went to a showing of the Rocky Horror Picture Show. Or for that matter, any number of movies where the audience is quite involved. And so you have the communal development and all the things that fans do and all the fan created projects. And again, the internet's allowed a lot of that, has only given more and more evidence for this kind of activity that seems like religion. Because if people are creating something and not just sitting there passively and watching a movie, they're involved. They're creating their own characters, their own films, their own stories. And that begins to have some of the hallmarks of religion in that way with their involvement. Yeah, you had a question.
It was going to be that one, but
About Rocky Horror Picture Show?
no. So you said the myths, morals, and rituals. So I think you've already defined myth, and then I think morals is more or less clear. But what would you say rituals are? So I have an idea of what is included.
Yeah, like again, following Geertz is kind of what connects the two. And it's a lot more than that. And ritual theorists bring up a lot of different types of rituals, so how they function. But going with that notion of it connecting the two things, I would say if you have a vision of the world and then a vision of how it should be, in the ritual space, that unity is realized. An example I usually give of something fairly familiar, something like Holy Communion in Christianity. Because if you have a vision of the world as a Christian, that the world is a place redeemed by Christ's death and resurrection, and therefore the moral is we ought to act as if that were the case and seek to realize that kingdom on earth and follow in his path and live that kind of life. The ritual, something like communion, realizes the presence of Christ in that sacrament, where people participating in that believe they have God within them, and they can go out in the world and be different and be transformed because of that. So a ritual is an activity where people believe there's some kind of connection happening between these different worlds. And again, it could be interpreted more symbolically. You don't have to believe in transubstantiation to get that, but that ritual is significant for Christians because that's where the ideal of God coming to this world is realized in a sense for them in their own worship experience, as opposed to just something that happened 2,000 years ago.
So what's the Jedi analog?
Well, there's a lot of myths. We got all the stories, obviously. And we have, moral codes, and we have people who want to live in that way, decreasing anger, fear, aggression, detaching from negative emotions, etc. The ritualized activities could be a bunch of things. It could be watching the films and talking about the community. It could be creating fan-based products. It could be, writing about it on blogs. It could be, dressing up and running around with lightsabers. And some of that, cosplay isn't always religion. Sometimes it is just entertainment, but there are people who do that, who do connect it to a certain moral vision, a way of life, a way they think about things. And, at that point, it begins to have more of the elements than just cosplay or just entertainment. Yeah.
What do you think about deity being necessary for something to be religion? Do you think that's present? Like, for something, do you think that needs to be present for something to be religion?
It really isn't, because again, if you look at Buddhism,
Jainism too.
yeah, there's a bunch of things that normally qualify as religions. And again, when Westerners came to those areas, they might say, "Oh, it's not a religion. This doesn't have God," and yet that proved to be a very limiting way of seeing it, because Buddhism is a way of life and does have beliefs about a transcendent order, and if you have a notion of rebirth and transcending rebirth, even though nirvana is not really a thing, it is transcendence of this world. So it has all the form of religion, where there's a path, there's a problem, you're seeking to overcome selfishness through detachment, through enlightenment, etc. But it's not based around a deity. There's gods in Buddhism. They're running around and doing various stuff, helping Siddhartha find enlightenment, but they're not the main event,
Right.
at all. And in that way, you also see that in Jainism, which is not really focused on a deity. Confucianism really isn't. Taoism, it's arguable what the way is or how transcendent it is. It's not a god in the normal sense.
And for that matter,
Always.
Taoism is also similar to how there were gods in it, and certain sects have more or less varying degrees of emphasis on those gods. Like the Celestial Master Taoists are going to have more of an emphasis on them than, say, Pole Star Taoists.
And if we're counting Scientology, I don't think there's God in Scientology.
There most
There is.
certainly is.
I know there's like an alien that made all the souls.
And then there's L. Ron Hubbard.
Or is that
Well,
another-
the deity like reincarnated as the leader of Scientology that created it and then wrote the book down and then died and reincarnated
L. Ron
as the new
Hubbard.
leader.
Yeah,
But-
gotcha, gotcha.
Well, what qualifies as a god? Because gods in a lot of religions, they're not all powerful. And so again, there's supernatural figures with various powers. A lot of people believe in those. And it's like Marvel superpowers, right? They're running around, they're doing all this stuff. But if you're into Marvel, you're not really worshiping Thor. Loki maybe, but it's not really about them. They're very flawed, they're very imperfect. But the messages of the Marvel movies transcend just what the gods are doing or saying. Rather, they're the theater where all the events are played out. And that's why, gods have that function in a lot of religions, where they're not really what it's mainly about. And there must be there's something larger than just those characters in many cases. I don't know if that answers your-
That does answer my question. I think what I was getting at more is, is like a spiritual aspect necessary, like a belief in something real that's outside of, our observable reality.
Supernatural?
Yeah, supernatural.
Or numinous.
Like, do you think
Like
that's
Nirvana.
required?
I really don't, because I think, again, the way that's understood is often in kind of transcendent Western terms. And I think sometimes that may be misleading. Even talking about something like the Buddha nature in Buddhism, it may be wrong to hypostasize it, view it as an external thing, because what's the Buddha nature? It's ability to become enlightened. And here it is. And if you're a Mahayana Buddhist in particular, samsara is nirvana. We're all in nirvana already. We just have to realize it. We don't need to get anywhere. We don't need to do anything. All you need to do is have satori and you're there. So it's not necessarily a transcendent experience. In some ways, it's the collapsing of the transcendent and the immanent, or the illusion of a separate transcendent has to cease to exist. So again, the more we talk about a supernatural, it sounds like we're talking about something beyond the natural. And even, religious people who talked about God in previous eras might not have understood that distinction because God was part of their world. God was running around and doing stuff and parting the Red Sea and things like that. So it's not a separate dimension. Exactly. That's already kind of a modern category that distinguishes them. So again, the more you interrogate these categories, the sloppier they get and the harder it is to make distinctions. That's what we do in religious studies courses, right? We just tear down all the categories. So, but it
The name
allows
that
you to.
can't be named, it's not the eternal name.
Right, yeah.
Kind of goes back to this definition of religion, because you have a lot of religions out there, like Buddhism, stuff that's out there on gods. But I would honestly say across the board, every religion has some sort of self-betterment program.
Sure.
But you have a section of religions out there that it's more of attaining a relationship with your specific God.
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that, like in the
Sure,
supernatural, like us,
not
for-
necessary.
like Christians specifically we are
Right.
gaining righteousness, sanctification to get to God, basically become perfect here and get, yeah. But for them, like Jedi, it's a self-betterment program for yourself. And that's where I kind of ask the question back, it goes back to the very question, how do you define a religion? And this is where my question, why is it that a lot of people deny Jediism as a religion? If it's just a self-betterment program, because it's not like Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and all this Mormonism, Jehovah's Witnesses stuff. Why is it that a majority of people would see Jediism as more of science fiction thing and not an actual religion?
Well, I mean, because it seems silly, right? I mean, it's like, how could it possibly be a religion? It's from a movie. People don't take it seriously. And I think a lot of fan-based activities like that, people can be so into something and fans just love these stories and base their lives on them, etc. But someone outside that is going to think that's silly because it's fictional. It's not a real religion. And something that has the status of a religion through history that we've come to regard as a religion, we're less likely to question. Because the interesting thing is, too, I was thinking about this as you were saying that there are religions that we accept completely as religions. We don't question them. Where, again, a transcendent may be entirely missing. And I'm talking here about particular ways people understand religions, even that clearly do have a transcendent dimension. Take Judaism, for example. There's a lot of people who belong to Jewish communities, have a Jewish identity, speak of themselves as religiously Jewish, who are atheists, who do not believe in God, who do not believe in an afterlife, but they do all the rituals because it's important to their communal identity and they have moral beliefs associated with it. And or think about Unitarians who came out of Christianity, and yet, a lot of Unitarians are atheists. A lot of Unitarians say they hate religion, and yet they're going to church every Sunday morning, and they're singing hymns, they listen to sermons. So they're choosing to do that, and they have an identity through it, and they have moral principles, and they have tax exempt status because historically of how they're viewed. But you look at the way people actually think about religions, again, from a sociological, anthropological standpoint, which is what I always come back to, because it seems like that's the best way to think about how religion functions. It often doesn't matter that much what people believe, but how it functions in their lives. And this is where I think people have been, people outside of fan communities have been unwilling to grant that seriousness to fan communities that actually those communities themselves have. And I know if I really want to throw monkey wrench in the works here too, we can talk about the purple spaghetti monster.
Oh, yeah.
Because
The Pastafarians.
yeah, the Pastafarians, because that was a joke, right? That was something that started to make fun of religion and the lack of evidence for certain claims, et cetera, et cetera. But people created that as a way of putting forward certain principles that they believe are important, like the importance of verifiable beliefs, or the fact that they don't want people imposing beliefs on them that are not theirs, etc. So there are principles that come along with Pastafarianism, even though it is a joke. It's not that they believe literally in the purple spaghetti monster, but those beliefs function as a way to create meaning for someone who believes that. In the same way, people can have an atheist club that is denying beliefs, but is also forming a community that stands for something and has certain moral values. So,
All right, I think
No, well, actually, Dustin wants to ask a
Yeah, we'll
question.
go.
Justin has a question.
we'll try to see if Dustin, you can try your audio, Dustin.
Is this working?
Are you saying anything?
Yeah, can you hear me?
He's trying to go through his phone or something.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
State for the record, the fellow.
Nothing?
Pastafarian.
All right.
We'll see if he,
I was a Pastafarian.
you can type it out, Dustin.
Okay.
Also, is anybody here not, I want to take a picture. Does anybody not want their picture to be taken?
Yeah, go ahead and take a picture. I mean,
I'm looking for
okay
anybody
with
who
that.
doesn't want to be in the picture. Nobody? Okay.
Well, you can take another picture. and
Take
no.
a better picture.
Take a
My
better picture.
picture probably sucks.
We should,
I'll
we did
post it in.
outside afterwards, so we can like everybody's favorite.
Yeah, I like to get one when we're in the middle of doing stuff though, so everybody,
Just have a
you know.
Everybody just looks.
Yeah. Just a bunch of guys hanging around.
You can move on while I get this thing typed out. Okay, so
Okay,
apparently,
so it's a long one.
It's a
Really
big-
quickly, I'm not trying to be super controlling, but there were other questions that I did send to Lyden from other participants in this group, and so we're doing pretty good on time. We got 45 minutes left, but I just want to make sure that we are mindful of that, because and I love the discussion, don't get me wrong, but I just want to make sure that those other questions are addressed in this.
yeah, I was trying to kind of slip that in as I went along. So I
That's
think
fine.
we've talked about most of them, but if somebody feels like they submitted a question that was not addressed, they want to come back to something they had given to Micah and be like, hey, he didn't say that much about that. We could certainly come back to that. So if there is something particular, speak now, and we could go to that. But
You
I think that-
mentioned earlier something, you said people who watch Marvel movies don't worship Thor.
They worship
And I wanted to circle back to that.
Maybe they do.
because If Jediism is a religion, certainly you'd have to concede that like following the Marvel movies would equally have to be considered a religion if you consider the other one. So I'm wondering is there any kind of group of people that aren't going to be considered a religion? Like I'm thinking of like working at like Amazon, maybe could be considered a religion. Like you've got the ritual, you've got like,
You've
there's.
got
no
the
moral code.
LGBT.
No, there's a moral code, you gotta poop in bags and stuff, like there's, it's just terrible, right? Like, I mean, is
Well,
there?
are they, first of all, are they choosing to do that? Are they finding
Wait,
meaning to
does
that? or
religion
is
have
it-
to be voluntary? I feel
I
mean,
promotes-
Scientology
most of
isn't,
the time
and it's
religion's
considered a
not.
religion.
Well, I think if you're tying someone down and making them sit through something, I'm not sure that is actually their religion, if they're not, choosing to participate in it, if they're just forced to be part of it. Or, because not everything has meaning to us, right? It's like, it sounds like everything could be religion, and in a way, that's possible, but I wouldn't choose to analyze every activity religiously. And, take ritual, for example, if I do something repeatedly that is meaningful, then it may be considered a religious ritual. If I get up every morning and I bow a certain direction and say a certain prayer or something, then that's probably meaningful to me. If I get up and I brush my teeth, that's not really a religious ritual. I just want to, my mouth smells bad. I get up and I want to brush my teeth.
Is it a ritual if you're a dentist?
Good question. Well, I don't know, because if you believe in dental hygiene strong enough, if it becomes, your basis for reality, not just your basis for income, though, I'd say, if you really believe in it, it might look like that. And again, this sounds silly, right? Because it sounds like now everything is. But again, I would say, is it that religion has to be a separate activity in our lives? I think, again, that's kind of the bias, it's kind of a Western bias to think, I do this thing on the weekends or Sunday mornings or something, as opposed to it being a structuring principle for everything I do. There's a lot of tribes, for example, who do all kinds of rituals. They go out on a hunt, they do a ritual, somebody's going to give birth, they do a ritual. And you say, what's your religion? They say, what's religion? We don't have what religion? We don't have something separate we do. We just do all this stuff. And our whole life is infused with these rituals that clearly are about spirits and ancestors and things.
So isn't there a difference between what the tribes are doing and what Christians do then? Because I think it's important to just say like religion or not religion. There needs to be more than just that.
Is it important to say that?
Well, because if you're just trying to, like the way that you're going, you're saying that the distinction is kind of fuzzy, right? So now we're lumping Christianity together with Star Wars, and I feel like they're fundamentally, they function different, they've done different things in the world, people think about them differently. So they're not the same, so they have differences in more than just religion, not religion.
Well, they clearly are different in the same ways that Christianity is different from Islam. Christianity is different from Buddhism. Taoism is different. from-
Confucianism is different from
But
Christianity.
those all
They're all
have
different.
central tenets, they have books, they have.
Well, so
they
do,
claim
so
to
can
be
tribes.
religious.
Tribes can have central tenets.
Star Wars has books.
Yeah.
It has movies.
They have the Jedi Code.
Are there central tenets of Star Wars though? Because I feel
That's
like
what
all
I'm
the
saying,
characters
like,
kind of
there's a difference
disagree and
between a
there's
story
conflict.
and
there
a
is-
religious
Is there
story.
agreed upon way of interpreting?
Although there's no agreed upon way of interpreting other holy books.
Yeah, that's the-
kind of got
Just
me
look at
there.
the
And
Look at
the
the
Jedi.
Jedi, for example. You got the old Republic, you had the Jedi that basically beat the Sith, but then there just came a point where they just became blind to the fact that they had an evil guy running the entire world of Coruscant. And then they basically became blind to it, and they all disagreed over what the Jedi are supposed to do, what the Jedi are not supposed to do, and it's just like. I do agree that there needs to be a distinction between Christianity and Jediism.
Well, there is.
I mean,
Yeah.
like, there needs to be a distinction between what is a religion.
Well, more
and
than
what
just
is
they're both
something-
religions, because once they're both religions, then we're saying, look, there's.
Well,
what's the-
okay,
what's the
here's,
point of?
here's another way of thinking about it. Again, trying to think of religion as a substantive definition, as a thing that's.
But some people do
encapsulated.
think of it that way.
Yeah, but they should, because
Well, that's
it's
your
a,
opinion.
it's a process. No, I think if you look at it enough, it's a process, it's interactive, and also religions don't stay in little boxes, because it becomes very hard to decide even what is really Christian. And Christianity isn't one thing. There's many different Christianities, and the more you study religion, the more you realize there's a family of things that falls under certain labels, but tremendous diversity within Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or what have you. So much so that when you teach about this stuff in an intro course, as I do, I'm continually saying, this is what Buddhists believe, except for those people, they don't believe that. You know, and then you're constantly qualifying it. So maybe think of it this way instead. If you think of religious studies as a discipline, as I do, as an academic discipline, it's a way of looking at things. You might say, well, everything is religion. How do we distinguish things religiously? Well, suppose you study economics. Everything has an economic dimension. Everything has.
Evolution has an economic
I mean,
dimension.
all of history can be examined economically. Is it all economics? No, but that's one way of looking at society and civilization. Everything has a historical dimension. Everything has an anthropological dimension. Everything has a chemical dimension. So a discipline is a way of looking at the world and allows you to see certain things through certain categories and concepts. And some things are going to stand out more so. You know, maybe going to church seems more religious than brushing your teeth, granted. But I'm not going to say that couldn't be a religious activity for somebody. Maybe it is. Probably not going to be a shake up the world totally. But you know, in that sense, you look at activities in a certain way and see certain things. In the same way that you could do that through an economic lens or a historical lens or whatever. So again, I don't think of it religion as a thing that's either there or not there. I think of it as a way of looking at activities and thinking about the significance behind it. And I don't think it belittles religious activity in that way, but rather allows people to find religion where they find it and find it meaningful where they find it. So it shouldn't threaten religious people that maybe some people are doing this other thing that they think is kind of silly, because that doesn't take away from this activity over here. It just means they're thinking about this in very different ways.
So you mentioned a word there, discipline. And I want to kind of bring this back to vocations, because you kind of said something earlier. I want to paraphrase. I don't remember exactly what you said, but you said basically, you know, it's your job, like it's not really like your religion. But I can't help but wonder about people like George Lucas or the people who produce Star Wars, who it is their, Star Wars is their job. There's lots of people.
Yeah,
now,
but
I
those
mean, 'cause it's
people
just-
also fans of Star Wars, and I mean, like Dave Filoni, for example, big fan of Star Wars, and then we could in some sense consider those people as the sort of religious protege of Star Wars.
Yeah, and like they make money by proliferating Star Wars,
Yeah.
just like a dentist makes money by proliferating dental hygiene and toothpaste and that kind of thing.
You could give it like a priest makes money by collecting donations from the church, and he lives his life at the church, spreading the religion, but the people who come to the church pay him. It's not necessarily his job, it's his way of life, as it's not a secondary feature, it's just how he exists. George Lucas exists making Star Wars. He doesn't exist separately and then make Star Wars.
Yeah, it might or might not be what you support yourself with financially. So whether you find it meaningful or not, I think what I meant to imply before is that because something is your way of life, you might have a job you hate, but you have to work there to pay the bills. That wouldn't necessarily be how you find meaning. You might find meaning in something totally different. Maybe there's somebody who, works all day, checking groceries at Target or something, but, actually they find meaning in some activity they do totally separately that they're not paid for. But it can change. It can vary. I never thought people were going to pay me to teach courses on Star Wars. Honestly, how did that happen? That's crazy. So, initially what I was going to do to make a living when I was a youngster, it was not that. Even when I entered religious studies, I didn't think I was going to end up having a professorship of religion and film. That's just crazy. But that's great because I like it. It's fun and I have meaning in it. So. People can either have meaning or not have meaning in their job. And of course, as their jobs change, they might be lucky. You might be an amateur musician and then suddenly, your band hits it big and you can pay the bills with that and do it all the time. But if not, you're going to have to keep doing garage band on the weekends. So that's independent of the question of whether it's the thing you find meaningful. But I would certainly grant that your profession can be what you find meaningful. It certainly can be and ideally should be. That's great if that works out, obviously.
Or is it religious?
Well, it depends, right? I mean, if you're a religious leader, it wouldn't be contestable
Yeah.
that it is.
Are you saying if you like your job, it's a religion?
No,
Okay.
no. But it could be your
It's a
center
matter
of
of finding
meaning, right?
meaning in it, just like how people find meaning in religion.
Right. You might define it as where you find meaning, but you might not. You might find meaning in some other things. And again, it's kind of the person's own judgment about where they find meaning, how they're finding purpose, etc. So it would vary. I mean, there are filmmakers who clearly, express themselves in that way. An artist expresses themselves through their art. They may make a living as an artist. They may not. But if they have thrown themselves into that, it's probably more than just a way to make money. They are finding meaning through that. I think art in that sense is very much like religion. And being an artist can be a tantamount to a religious activity because it's also a meaning-making activity. And that's another distinction I would question or problematize is a distinction between art and religion. Because what is really the difference there? Often the artist is creating something for people to view, but it might be to participate in also. And they're someone who believes in that. They believe in the messages they're putting in their artwork, very much so. So and there is religious art after all. There's religious music, there's religious paintings, etc.
Religious film, Passion of the Christ. Why has no detail on that?
Dustin had a question.
Yeah, we'll do Dustin's question.
Yeah, it says, wow. Dr. Lyden, thanks for your time. I can certainly see how people can take all the fictional claims made in Star Wars as religion, although I'm not sure how many adhere to it as religion. But do you think the creator's intention has any bearing on whether it really is a religion? People might take all the Star Wars claims originally intended as fictional claims as true and normative, but is it more proper to say they have made it a religion? But it is not, by its nature, a religion because it was not created as symbol system which functions to give people meaning, depicting a vision of how the world is believed to be and should be, or to include any sort of morals apart from those already existing in actual worldviews. And I would even answer briefly, no, the creator doesn't have any say on whether Star Wars is a religion because Lucas has seen how people took it so seriously, and he said publicly, it's not a religion. It's not a religion, people, but they too take it as a religion, as I didn't state it.
And yeah, this is really a question about authorial intention, about, texts and how we interpret them, and it does go to things like art, et cetera, in that someone can create something with a certain meaning in mind, or not, maybe they're just trying to make money, whatever, but what people do with it is a different thing. So audience reception is a very big part of film research, what people do with films and the directions they go with that. Star Wars fans are a good example of that, how they have exceeded what Lucas had in mind and created their own universes. And, they've tried to rear those people in and say, wait a minute, you can't do that. Here's the canon. But people are not stopped by that. So they're going to create their own things out of it. And, indeed, religions are a little bit like this too, in many ways, where they exceed, the original plans of the founders. And does that make it less valid? Is it more valid because it's true to the original vision? Not necessarily. And I don't know if I should invoke Life of Brian in this context, but if you have seen that, Brian says, no, I'm not the Messiah, when people want to call him the Messiah, and they say, only the true Messiah denies his Messiahship. It's like, no, okay, so I am the Messiah. You are the Messiah. So they're determined to view him as the Messiah no matter what. And so you can't totally control what people will do with something. And as religions evolve, I think it's in the eye of the consumer of the religious practice, what they do with it, what they make out of it, more than just the original intentions of the makers don't necessarily determine that. Yeah.
And this relates to, what we talked about in religion and Star Wars in relation to Star Wars and canonicity, which is even discussed in chapter 9 of the Myth Awakens. The ion cannon will fire several shots to make sure any enemy ships will be out of your flight path. Canonization, tribal theologians, and imaginary world building, because there are people who do argue against the Disney about what should be canon, and you even have people who are fans and add to that canon, which in a way revives Star Wars franchise, like the example that was given in this book with Timothy Zahn when he wrote the Thrawn books in the 90s, and people were just swooped back into Star Wars because they saw the characters from the original trilogy back into the canon.
Mhm. Yeah, and not everybody has accepted what Disney has done with the canon. They did it determined what's in the films, but I don't have to accept that. I can make up my own stories about these characters who were in some of the novels that didn't make it into the canon, as it were. No?
I'm just gonna go ahead and make a truth claim. The sequels are not canon. Okay?
Oh,
They are
please.
absolute garbage. They are considered legends and
First-
not canon.
First two were all right. and
I'm
the
sorry.
other one we can
No,
forget.
no. They're just all garbage.
What would you say
I,
is canon?
Hold on.
I was almost gonna ask the exact same
Yeah,
question, like,
just
what
like-
is canon? What does that mean in this context? Because I feel like in
Everything's
most
just a Messiah.
religions, when they talk about canon, like Catholic versus Protestant, for instance, it's which books are real and which ones correspond to reality, or like which ones have merit. And in this case, it seems like canon and fanon don't really have any kind of distinguishing
Well,
features.
And this is
Except-
also a matter of what kind of canon is it? Like, is it a closed or open canon?
Yeah, which religions vary on that, whether you can add stuff to it. But I think, again, concept of canon, we're familiar with Western religions, usually it closes, say, you can't add any more stuff because this is what's authoritative. And yet people will still debate about that, obviously, as to what's in, what's outside. I guess the thing with Star Wars that's so interesting, and I think does provide more evidence for it being like a religion, is the fact that there even is this debate going on, because why is that even so important? As you say, these things didn't happen, right? They're not real, they're just stories. And yet people care about that because they might say, yeah, I don't like that movie. That wasn't a good conclusion. That sucked. I wanted a different story. And I wanted to have the Solo twins. I didn't want to have, Ben Solo and Rey, I wanted to have that, which came out of the non-canonical Legends books. And people feel that way. So, lines are drawn by somebody who's in charge, who says, okay, this is canon, this isn't. But somebody's always going to disagree. And they're heretics in the view of the people in charge, but that doesn't stop people from believing that this is still has authority for them. So even though it's fictional, it's still obviously important to people. Because again, if you're finding some meaning in this, if you say you're basing your life on it or something in some way, it may matter what direction the story goes. Otherwise, why were people upset by the ending of The Sopranos? They're still talking about it, or the ending of Lost, Like,
Gilligan's
lousy
Island.
ending. Gilligan's Island, right, yeah. Well, they were movies afterwards.
Oh.
But they weren't very good either. so.
I think the thing that I'm hung up on there is it's kind of important questions like on whose word. Because like the reason that I take the Star Wars movies as canon is like, okay, well, it's coming from authority. Like I trust them, like they have kind of the power to say like, yeah, this is what happened in Star Wars, where if this is what I'm talking to like.
Do you trust Disney? Really?
I mean,
I
they're
trust
the
the
author
people-
of Star Wars.
I trust the people.
They're in the driver's seat.
It,
Right,
it
I
depends
trust
on
the-
who's doing the movie or show.
For something like this, I trust the person in the driver's seat to tell me what's part of the story. Granted, I'm not really invested in Star Wars a whole bunch, but like, I'm gonna take Disney's word over like, a sweaty basement dweller being like, no, dude, this one's way, this version's way better. Like I said, for me, with something like that, that I don't really see as religion currently.
That's why you gotta go back to the man himself.
Yeah, I don't, it's a matter of authority there. Like
But
if somebody's.
people argued against social media.
I don't know, like if I'm,
And
if
that's
Marvel,
what I'm
even if
saying.
it's like a Marvel universe thing, I'm not gonna listen to a fan fiction and be like, yeah, that's what happened in that story. It's like, and it doesn't really, I wouldn't say it matters with like a fictional story. Like that, like, if whether it's fan fiction or from the person, but if we're gonna say like, what's the official narrative here, the authority would be a big deal for me.
Yeah, well,
Source.
but do you accept that authority is the thing? Because
Mhm.
that's what it comes down to, is the people who don't accept the authority. And with Star Wars also, it's such a mess because George Lucas kept changing his mind
Mm.
and kept literally changing the movies and then denying that he had changed them. And which he obviously had. People were having to find old prints and say, hey, wait a minute, you changed it. So here you have the case where the creator doesn't even know what he's saying. He's just changing his mind. It was very bizarre. I will say that the MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, has been much more intentional about making everything fit together. And they're kind of messing around with stuff too at this point. It's becoming a little confusing with the multiverse. I don't know if anybody's watching What If, but that's
Yes.
kind of mind blowing too. And I'm not sure exactly what's going on. And I'm still trying to figure out how Captain America went back and married his sweetheart, whether he really pulled that off or not in the same universe. But
Main
That's-
timeline.
but I know I've heard it, but
Heard 6
but there's still
It's
different
just
accounts of that.
And
And
isn't
but at the
Star
same
Wars
time, the
Marvel
MCU
Cinematic
makers of those films
Isn't Star
have
Wars
tried to
Marvel
have
Cinematic?
coherence. And the fact that they've done it over like 22 films is kind of amazing.
Mm.
Star Wars is actually much more fragmented and in that way looks much more like a religion. There's a lot more debates about that. And again, accepting authority, you can debate that. You can say, maybe the Council of Nicaea, maybe they messed up.
Right.
Maybe they made a mistake
For sure.
and came up with the wrong formula. Maybe they should have come up with a different decision. But That's what won the day and it went forward and they exterminated all the heretics.
And
So
that
that's
just
what we
puts you
got.
in a new subgroup under, like, you're like, they said something wrong about what Jesus said. I think Jesus said something else. They would still be their group and then you would be in your own category because you changed something.
Just like Martin Luther.
Yeah, or then we take Islam. Islam has a different view of Jesus than Christianity. That he is the Messiah, but not God, that he didn't die. Certainly didn't die for anybody's sins on the cross. He got this totally different story. And they think they've got the right story. So how did they do that? Well, they had enough people who believed that and it became a gigantic religion. So people can argue about those things and they can and should probably, but there's still a group of people who has a different authority and a different version of it. And those multiple stories and multiple canons always exist. That's again, one of the realities you encounter when you start to look at the history of religions.
You said a little while ago, you mentioned myths. And you said that was kind of like an ingredient that you had to, if you want something to be a religion, right?
Mhm.
And then you said that film was kind of, could fit into that category. Is that what you said, or?
Films can be like myths and I think operate in a lot of ways like mythology in some cultures.
Okay.
Where, again, and Christianity again is not the most mythological religions because it's more historical in some ways. And also it basically has got one story, one main story. Whereas something like Hinduism is so complicated. There's so many stories and all these different side plots and everything, or some tribal myths, etc. And that's very much the way the MCU is. The MCU is like Hindu mythology and its complexity. You could barely follow it. And you have to be really inside, even to know what's going on most of the time. If you wander into a Marvel movie and you stay through the 2 credit scenes, you got to be into it to know what those mean. Right? So that's already, it's a mythology, meaning a whole group of stories that fits together, that people find something in those and continue to come back to those for some reason. Yeah, is it religion? I don't know, but it resembles mythology very much so in its structure, in how elaborate it is and how pervasive it is.
Okay. So when they're, taking in those myths, or like whatever it is, it's important if you wanted to make it a religion that they have to attribute meaning for it for their own lives and for how they view reality, right?
That's what I would say. Yeah, if it comes to be
So-
meaningful for them, then you could.
Right.
recognize
So is there
something.
something that a myth or something in that category would have that would make it more likely for people to give it meaning in that way than others? Like, are there elements that myths or popular myths have that others don't have that make it more attractable to more people?
Yeah, what caused it to be more successful
Yeah.
as a myth, you could say.
But I guess it's also a matter of who's attracted to the myth.
Right. I'm talking like, essentially in
Widely.
America. Yeah.
Mhm.
Alex, just look at charismatic churches, Christian churches.
Right. Yeah. But it's like, what about charismatic churches that draw people in? That
Well, this is how charismatic preachers do it, is that they appeal to one's emotions. You appeal to one's emotions and you get them to feel a certain way to align with your beliefs system. You'll get a huge, massive following. That's how Joel Osteen ended up getting like.
Well,
I don't know how many
that
thousands of
really
people live in
isn't-
Dallas.
Yeah, but I'm saying like, what is it about a myth or something in that category that sparks the emotions?
For Westerners, or not Westerners, for Easterners, it's usually either developing a sense of self, like myths that revolve around becoming one within yourself as well as one within your surroundings.
Okay.
So that have to deal with nature and whatnot, like the Native Americans did. They weren't Eastern religion, but their religion is probably the closest that would be able to relate to that to Westerners.
Or their spiritualities, because religion doesn't always apply to every culture.
Mhm.
And if people find something to connect with, I would say, this has actually been one of the most valuable, I think, things about finding this methodology to approach film that I've used. Because again, whether it's right or wrong to view them as being like religions, the method is useful because it does allow you to ask certain questions about why did this film succeed? But a lot of times critics kind of scratch their heads. Why was Star Wars so popular? Why was Titanic so popular? Nobody predicted that. But if you look at that and say, well, let's try to figure this out. What about this appealed to people?
Why were the Beatles popular? They got slammed by critics.
Okay, hold on, that's a separate matter. I'm
It's not, it's pop culture.
No, music is a whole separate thing.
Yeah, but Micah, Christianity gets slammed by critics. Islam gets slammed by critics. Why is that?
Religion gets slammed by critics.
Yeah, exactly. Name a religion that doesn't get slammed.
It may be harder with music because it is
Nihilism gets
abstract.
slammed.
There's critics to
Yeah,
nihilism too.
and again, that's what people are hearing and how that changes over time. I mean, the fact that, Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, and people thought it was horrible at first, and then a year later, they thought it was great. So why did that happen? They kind of got used to it. It kind of grew on them. They liked it. And so, in that way, there's ways that people can adjust their artistic taste, certainly, and get used to hearing certain things. But I think when we're talking about meaning structures and narratives and stories that connect, you can kind of analyze why that struck a chord with people at that time and its popularity, which normal film critics don't seem to get this. Its popularity of a film is because it connects with people at some deeper level than just, wow, it had great special effects and had good actors and it had a big budget. And those things don't guarantee success, actually. It has to be something deeper, almost ineffable. And that's what you begin to analyze. But there's no one set of characteristics that guarantees that. I would say it's very much situational. It depends on the context, why a particular film succeeds at a certain point in time, why it spoke to people. I mean, why was Casablanca a hit in 1943? Well, it was the middle of World War II. You know, it obviously, it worked for giving people a way to get through that time period and help them in a way. And now it's a, you know, it's a historical timepiece in many ways. It doesn't relate in the same way. So, you know, something about the time where a movie appears, like Star Wars, that works for people. What's amazing is that Star Wars continues to work, because I was into it in the 70s, but I thought, well, by the time I have kids, they're going to be like, what's Star Wars? And that has not happened, you know.
Yeah.
Everybody's into Star Wars, so it only grew.
Would you say that there's kind of like, I'm not sure like how concrete it would be, but like a set of questions that everybody kind of asks themselves. Like if I'm wondering about who I am, it's like Eastern religion might be popular because it answers that question. Would you say that it's important for a religion to answer that question tangibly if people want to connect with it?
It has to answer some questions
Yeah.
that people are seeking answers to about, you know, I would say about meaning, about purpose, about identity, in some way, about what I should be, what I am. So those are the kind of questions that sound very generic, but that do come up. And if it speaks to those questions, yes, people are going to be more likely to attach to it, more likely to find.
So would you say that one of the major, like it's more likely to be a major religion if it answers all of those questions and not just some of them?
Well, a major religion, you're
Like
saying?
a more popular religion?
Or, well, it has to be though straightforward enough people can relate.
Yeah, so it has to have
and-
coherency, like it has to make
Yeah.
sense in some sort of way.
Right, and it has to offer some solutions to some concrete problems, right? Like, you know, I feel like I do bad things. I feel like I'm a sinner. Okay, we've got a solution for you. You know, someone has taken away your sins.
Right.
Here's the plan. Or, you know, I am consumed by selfishness. The Buddha says, well, we can do something about that. We're going to eliminate selfish desires and you're not going to suffer anymore. So there's some kind of schema for finding meaning if it's laid out very intelligibly. But sometimes it's less obvious, you know, and more complicated. And, you know, like tribal religions don't necessarily have that same structure. They provide meaning for life, but maybe they don't provide salvation in the same way. They may not even be interested in the afterlife particularly. They just, you know, I want to have a good hunt tomorrow. I want to make sure I get a bison. So, you know, I'm going to pray to the spirits about that. But that's still meaningful. That's still structuring their life. So the questions may vary, again, depending on context.
Right, yeah.
Major world religions, as we talked about them now, I think usually have a large conception of the human problem and the solution to that problem. I would say that's generically true, just in general. Yeah, but yeah.
You're begging the question, what are the questions that Star Wars answers, and what are those answers?
Well, actually, this is kind of interesting because, and I'm gonna stand up here because, you know, I mean, I can. The force is strong with me right now. And this actually will, and this it kind of relates to what John was just talking about of how religions answer people's questions about certain problems like selfishness or wanting to become righteous. And then this really, and I guess this really depends on the culture that you're talking about. And Dave Filoni actually addresses this kind of thing with the prequels. It was in episode 2 of Disney Gallery's Star Wars: The Mandalorian, where it all goes back to the prequel, specifically in episode 1, where Qui-Gon wants to be a father figure to Anakin because he sees potential in Anakin and realizes that Anakin needs a father figure. He doesn't have one. And so when he's fighting against Maul on Tatooine, he's fighting for Anakin out of love for him. And he wants to take Anakin on as an apprentice because he sees that the Jedi, they've lost their way and they're involved in politics. But of course, Qui-Gon dies, and so Obi-Wan takes Anakin on as his apprentice. But the problem is that he views Anakin as a brother, and or even early on as a liability, kind of like in the same way that people view Jar Jar. And so because Anakin doesn't have that father figure, hey, that's how Dave Filoni described it. I like Jar Jar, but
That's how everyone describes it.
but anyway, and so because Anakin doesn't have a father figure in Obi-Wan or Qui-Gon, it allows Palpatine to get in and as a father figure, and who eventually converts him to the dark side, and that's what leads to Order 66. And so it's really that issue of, a lot of kids, particularly in the United States, and maybe it's like this in other countries too, they didn't really grow up with a father figure that they needed. Their fathers left them, or their fathers were just very distant from them. And and Star Wars really speaks to that, because that's why George Lucas even told Dave Filoni, kids need this.
Yeah, so there are morals like that that come out of it. I mean, I would say for me, when I got into Star Wars initially, ObiWan's self-sacrifice kind of blew me away. I went to see this silly movie and suddenly it had this Christ figure in it. And that was meaningful. I thought that was actually a powerful moment. And then you have Luke believing in him, not really seeing him, hearing him, having to make this act of faith. So, religion was just right there for me, I saw. And then by the time you get to the end of Return of the Jedi, with Luke basically sacrificing himself to try to save his father. Again, it's the love of the father. It's his attachment to his father that saves him. I thought there was a clear message there, which again, I think is a very Christian message actually, because the Jedi in some ways are like these Eastern mystics talking about detachment, and you should be able to go into battle and kill your father. Just kind of detach yourself from emotion. It'll be okay. Just don't hate him and it'll be okay. Which is basically the advice that Arjuna gets in the Bhagavad Gita, the Hindu text. But Luke doesn't buy it. He says, no, I'm going to save my father.
So
And
one
he
of the
does.
questions that Star Wars answers is
What kind of person should you be? Should you be willing to sacrifice yourself for others, for friends, for family? Are all people redeemable? Yes, they are. People can turn back from the dark side. People can be saved. Everyone is savable in a way. Everyone can repent. Anyone can change. Anyone should be given a chance to change. So, and again, those things may seem like, prosaic morals, and we could probably pull that out of almost any story, any narrative, but a kind of, overarching multi-film saga, again, takes on that mythological form because, and you all can't appreciate this totally because of your age, but when I was growing up, when I was like your age, we had to wait 3 years in between those movies, and we'd be sitting around saying, "What's going to happen?" There's a lot of late nights wondering, who is the other? Who is the other?
I felt that way with, even though I had read The Hobbit, when the movies were coming out, I was like that for an entire year before The Hobbit, all 5 armies came out, because it was like, oh, well, Sauron's gonna send his army to the Lonely Mountain, they're gonna fight him, this is a big deal.
Right, yeah, so when it's across time and we actually have to wait and talk about it, then you're more involved too in that sense. Yeah.
Why do you think something like Star Wars took up this religion aspect instead of something like the Wheel of Time series that came out roughly the same time?
Those didn't really appeal to a lot.
Because they have
Kind of goes back to what I was asking.
they have the same morals and the same questions that they answer, but
They weren't movies, right?
It was a book or maybe 3 or something, and then it got made into a movie in '78 by Disney. Then it didn't go so well, and then they made it into a movie again in 2016, and then it didn't go so well that time.
Okay.
what are you talking about?
Wrinkle of Time.
No,
Wheel of
The
Time?
Wheel of Time series, the
14,
14-book
yeah.
saga
That.
that is currently being adapted into a TV show, finally coming out
Mhm.
in the next month or so.
oh, well, that's when it's going to become a religion.
Right, I don't even know that, so.
What?
I think everyone's heard of Star Wars, but most people haven't heard of that.
Yeah,
Because
this is the first time I've ever heard.
Movies are much more effective than books because a lot of people don't read, first of all. Although Harry Potter's an exception because everybody read that.
I never read that.
I haven't
actually.
read Harry
Oh,
Potter.
really?
Yeah.
That's
I say I
not
read
right,
a
but,
The Wheel of Time
uh,
series, but
But a lot of people read Harry Potter before it was even a movie, obviously. And then the movies were coming out as the books were being written, which was interesting.
Just like Game of Thrones.
But yeah, yeah, exactly. Then there's Game of Thrones, which also obviously was a big hit. And I have to admit, I haven't watched Game of Thrones at all, and I had no desire to actually. and the people were disappointed with the ending. I know that. So, but I think again, it's what do you connect with? If there's something about a story that connects with you, then you'll be more likely to join that. And again, there was something that hit me in Star Wars, something that hits other people, and why they like that. So a really interesting question I find with films or books for that matter is, why do people like a particular one or a TV show? And it says something about a person if you know what their favorite movie is, because you can discern sometimes what their most deeply held beliefs are, if they really like that story and it speaks to them. So
Yeah, we'll do Dustin's question then back there.
And then
My favorite movie is Jackass.
And then that'll be the last.
say no more.
We got
Say no
three
more.
last. All right, so
Wait, sorry. that was
Dustin.
my bad, sorry.
yeah, so Star Wars was created as a movie and people can base their metaphysics and ethics on it, but that would be to base their worldview on what was created as fiction. They're saying, I don't care that it's fiction, I'm going to treat it as if it is not. Is their doing so reasonable?
I would answer that by, again, going outside the Western context to Hindu mythology again, and how all of life is a dream in a sense. Everything is an illusion and reality is something beyond all this in kind of a broad Hindu conception. And there are stories where a person falls asleep and has a dream and lives an entire life and then wakes up in the morning, but then goes to a place where everybody remembers him and he lived there for 50 years. And how is that possible? That can't be real, right? And yet it sort of is, because he just had this dream and his dream became reality. And the whole thing, of course, is a story told in Hinduism to show the point that in a way life is like a dream. So that's part of the message of it. But that story obviously is not meant as a literal piece of history, because it doesn't even make sense as a literal piece of history.
I think you could also like draw an analogy to Christianity as well, because there's tons of parts of Christianity that, there are parables in which there are these moral kind of claims behind them, sort of like these bases for these messages or ideals. So yeah, like even with a lot of religions that we would, just at the base be like, yeah, that's totally a religion. There's pieces of it where it's like not even supposed to be taken as literal by the author.
Right, and yet John Dominic Crossan, the New Testament scholar, uses this as an example because he's questioned a lot of things as literal history that are in the New Testament, and people have given him a hard time about that, of course. And he said, well, let's just think about this for a second. Imagine Jesus telling the parable of the prodigal son or something, or the Good Samaritan, and then his disciples saying, where did this happen? Are you sure this happened? Give us the location. We want to know the guy's name. We want to know the details. And Jesus would be like, no, you missed the point. You missed the whole point of the story. That the story is true and provides a moral for people, even though it is not intended as history. Now, again, one has to decide if that's true of a given religious story. Obviously, in some stories, it may be more important to assert them as history than others, but it's at least possible, as your example shows, to take something that is not even intended as history and find meaning in it. And I think that's, again, kind of what Star Wars fans or fans of some of these other things are doing when they're so into it. They say, I'm basing my life on this. And they know these aren't, true stories, meaning they happened literally historically. But again, I think that's maybe a lot less important in some ways. And sometimes, for religious people, for followers of traditional religions, that is also true, that they don't need to take everything in the Bible literally. There's a lot of Jews who don't believe that Moses parted the sea like that and they walked through. But they do know that the people survived somehow, and this narrative kept them going through a lot of crap that they've gone through for thousands of years. So there's got to be something in this story, even if it wasn't literally like that. So in that sense, again, if you find something meaningful in it, then it's meaningful. It's easier to say that about Judaism, which has been around thousands of years, than Star Wars. But give us 2,000 years. We'll see where we're at then.
we have.
Yep, Drew. And
My
then
question
I think you'll have last one.
changed after what you just said, so I think wasn't my initial question, so it's not fully in my head. I think I agree with you as far as like experientially, it doesn't really make a huge difference whether or not something happens. Like functionally in your life, you're not really going to notice the difference. If you find meaning in that, that's kind of the key issue. I think where I would have issue with that, like if I believe that myself, like I don't think maybe like anything Bible having literate, for instance, I would then wonder about like afterlife, for instance, like, you know, if there is a real afterlife, like in that case, my experience is kind of secondary importance, like what my direct experience is with the religion compared to the truthfulness of it, you know, for something like if there's an afterlife, that sort of thing.
Yeah, and obviously reality is different than our beliefs, so it may matter, you know, if I believe it or not, maybe it makes me feel better to believe my sins were taken away by Christ, but did that really happen? Is a separate question, right?
Right.
Or am I going to heaven or not after death is a separate question from what I believe.
Sure.
And so that's always true, but when we believe one thing, reality could be something else, we don't know for sure.
Right.
So, yeah, granted, that is definitely the case. We look at how religion functions, we can't adjudicate that question. But it is true that if you believe something is true, and if it really is true, that's different than believing it and it not being true.
Right.
I will certainly grant that. And also people can believe, you know, absolutely horrible things, which have terrible effects. I also don't want to make it sound like every belief is equally valid, because, you know, if I believe that if I smash a plane into the World Trade Center, I'm going to go to heaven. I don't think that's a great belief for people to be having. You know, I think that's a bad direction to go. So I would wish that person had a different belief. So in that sense, it does matter. You know, action matters also in terms of what people do.
Because like the thing that gets me on board with following Christ is what I believe about it in reality, how I believe it corresponds with reality. If I'm believing things for the effect, I did Pastafarian today. I can wear a colander on my head in my driver's license photo. That's a nice effect.
Yeah, but you know, then you're a religious minority.
Is anybody persecuting Pastafarians?
Yes, yes.
Anyway, yeah.
We paused it right now.
Is it possible to find meaning in something that's not religion?
Yes.
Sure.
Art.
And it, again, depends what we define as religion. See, I might say there's a religious dimension to anything in which you find meaning, but again, I realize I'm being tautological at this point, you know, kind of making a circular argument. So, yeah, I would say meaning is probably a bigger category than what we normally regard as religion, which is a bit more structured and has some more signifiers to it than just that. That would be true. You know, I guess I would also say, and this is maybe an insight I haven't dropped, you know, in the course of this conversation, but I would point out, is that religion, again, is not a unitary thing that I have this one religion and that's it, because people are influenced by all kinds of different ideas. And again, this is the history of religion. You know, look at Christianity, it's evolving out of Judaism, it's going in a different direction. They're picking up stuff from Stoic philosophy, they're talking about the logos, and where did that come from? So there's Greek thought, and then as it evolves, it picks up other ideas to articulate things. And so every religion is kind of in dialogue with multiple religious and cultural ideas all the time. So again, we don't live in a little religious box, which means that, you know, maybe it's okay to say, I'm a Christian, but I find some religious meaning in Star Wars, which some of that may be kind of like Christianity, some of it may be kind of different, but that's okay. You know, it's okay for me to find meaning in a variety of things. Some of them may resemble religions, some of them we may call religions, some of them maybe you don't call religions, but they're still functioning for you in some religious way to some extent. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. You know, it didn't ruin Christianity when they started using Stoic philosophy to articulate the notion of the incarnation. You know, it helped them out. It was a useful concept to borrow from Greek philosophy as it happened. So we don't have to be afraid of multiple influences in that way, because we live in a syncretistic world where these ideas are all affecting each other.
What's an example of something you could find meaning in that's not religion?
Well, I see you're talking to the wrong person, because I'm going to say it is religion.
Right.
But somebody else might say,
Music, that's an example,
yeah,
but I
right.
still have to say what I have to say.
Yeah, you get the last.
No, not about the Beatles. What comes to my mind, which relates to the stories relating to people addressing their problems and mythology and even religion in general, is just the fact of how franchises like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings appeal to former myths that people grew up with. Like with Star Wars, it was the monomyth proposed by Campbell, and in the case of Lord of the Rings, it was not only Christianity but also Norse mythology. It's people's familiarity with these mythologies that helps people to appeal to them.
There's
Yeah.
something familiar
Yeah.
about it. that
Well,
you
this
can
helps
feel.
people find appeal to these franchises.
And that again shows they've, like Star Wars has borrowed from so many things,
Exactly.
which was part of its success.
Philosophy,
That it wasn't
religion,
just created, tabula rasa out of nothing. It borrowed on these cultural influences. And that's one reason why it worked so well.
Exactly.
And I think for any religion that has worked well, that has succeeded, it is built on some of those influences, offers something new, but also connects to some need and utilizes enough concepts that are familiar that people could make sense of it. And that's certainly the case with Christianity, which was kind of a wacky idea from a traditional Jewish idea, but it tapped into a lot of things from Greek philosophy that kind of made more sense in the Hellenistic environment. Hence, there were a lot of converts all of a sudden from non-Jewish background because it made sense to them. So yeah, it's exactly what can happen with a movie also. George Lucas was very good at that, at kind of using things that looks kind of like a Western,
Samurai
it's like a
film.
samurai film. It's like all these different
Dune,
things.
Flash Gordon.
Mhm. Yep, all
All
that.
right, well, I think that wraps up our meeting here today. Yeah, round of applause.
Yeah, thanks so much. Very stimulating conversation. And, yeah, you all got great ideas. It's great to have this kind of conversation in person again, which we haven't had much of in the last few years or whatever. But